The morning of January 3rd, 2026 began like any other in Caracas. Power outages, empty grocery stores, the ever-present fear that gripped Venezuela's remaining residents. But by noon, news began to spread that seemed impossible, almost mythical in its scope. Nicolas Maduro, the man who had terrorized an entire nation for 13 years, had been arrested by the United States government following military strikes on Venezuelan soil. The dictator who had turned South America's richest country into a graveyard of democracy was finally in chains. To understand how this moment arrived, we must journey back decades to the origins of a man who would become one of the Western Hemisphere's most brutal leaders. Nicolas Maduro was born in 1962 in Caracas, the son of a union leader who instilled in him early rhetoric about class struggle and workers' rights. Unlike many Latin American strongmen who came from military or elite backgrounds, Maduro's path was decidedly ordinary. He never finished university, instead becoming a bus driver for the Caracas Metro in his 20s. It was unglamorous work, driving working-class Venezuelans through the capital's underground tunnels, but connected him to the masses and gave him a populist credibility that would later prove invaluable. During those years behind the wheel, he became involved in left-wing political organizing, joining radical movements that opposed Venezuela's traditional two-party system and the economic inequality that plagued the nation despite its vast oil wealth. His life changed forever in the 1990s when he met Hugo Chavez, the charismatic former military officer who had attempted a failed coup in 1992 and was building a revolutionary movement to overthrow Venezuela's establishment. Maduro became one of Chavez's earliest and most loyal followers, working as an organizer and propagandist for the movement that would eventually sweep Chavez to power in 1998. Where Chavez had natural charisma, military bearing, and an electric stage presence, Maduro offered something different: unwavering loyalty, organizational discipline, and a willingness to do the dirty work that revolutions require. As Chavez consolidated power through constitutional rewrites, nationalization campaigns, and the crushing of opposition, Maduro rose through the ranks, foreign minister, then vice president, always in the shadow, but always essential. When Hugo Chavez died of cancer in March 2013, Venezuela stood at a crossroads. The economy was already showing cracks from years of mismanagement, corruption, and oil dependency, but Chavez's personal popularity had held the system together through sheer force of personality. Maduro, his chosen successor, had none of that magic. He was wooden in speeches, lacked military credentials, and commanded little personal loyalty outside the hardcore Chavista inner circle. The April 2013 presidential election exposed his weakness. He barely won, claiming victory by just 1.5% over opposition candidate Enrique Capriles amid widespread reports of irregularities, voter intimidation, and ballot manipulation. Opposition protests erupted, and Maduro's response set the template for everything that would follow: mass arrests, violent repression by security forces, and the dismissal of all dissent as foreign-backed conspiracy. Where Chavez had ruled through a mix of charisma, patronage, and selective coercion, Maduro would rule through pure terror. The years from 2014 to 2017 saw Venezuela descend into what human rights organizations would later document as systematic crimes against humanity. When students and opposition activists took to the streets in 2014 to protest food shortages, inflation, and authoritarian overreach, Maduro unleashed the Bolivarian National Guard and armed pro-government gangs known as colectivos. The protests lasted months and left 43 people dead, many shot at close range by security forces using modified projectiles designed to cause maximum internal damage. The message was clear: public dissent would be met with lethal force. Political prisoners began to fill Venezuela's jails, held without charges in facilities like the Helicoide, a concrete fortress in Caracas that became synonymous with torture. UN investigators would later document beatings, electric shocks, sexual violence, and psychological torture, methods applied to young activists, journalists, and even children whose parents were opposition figures. But physical repression was only one pillar of Maduro's control. The other was the systematic destruction of democratic institutions. When opposition parties won a landslide victory in the 2015 National Assembly elections, giving them a two-thirds supermajority, Maduro simply made the legislature irrelevant. His loyalist Supreme Court declared all assembly decisions void. Then in 2017, facing the prospect of losing power through constitutional means, Maduro created an entirely new body, a constituent assembly elected through a sham vote boycotted by the opposition and designed to overwrite the Constitution and grant him effectively unlimited power. International observers condemned it as a coup against democracy, but Maduro pressed forward, knowing that control of oil revenue, the military, and the guns gave him the only votes that mattered. As Maduro tightened his political grip, the Venezuelan economy entered a death spiral unprecedented in modern peacetime history. Hyperinflation exploded beyond 1.6 million% by 2018, rendering the currency worthless and forcing citizens to carry bricks of cash to buy a loaf of bread, if bread could even be found. The causes were complex but rooted in decades of mismanagement. Over-reliance on oil exports, massive corruption, the nationalization and subsequent collapse of private industries, and Maduro's own catastrophic monetary policies. But the human cost was staggering. Hospitals ran out of basic medicines and supplies. Preventable diseases like malaria and diphtheria, once eliminated, returned with a vengeance. Malnutrition rates soared, particularly among children. Venezuelans lost an average of 24 pounds due to food scarcity, a phenomenon grimly termed the Maduro diet. Desperate citizens hunted stray dogs, cats, and zoo animals for food. Millions began to flee, crossing into Colombia, Brazil, Peru, and beyond, creating the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere's modern history. Over 8 million people displaced by 2025, rivaling Syria's exodus. Yet Maduro did not just preside over collapse, he weaponized it. Through the collapse system, government distributed food boxes. He ensured that only the politically loyal ate. Ration cards were tied to voter registrations, and those who attended opposition rallies or refused to participate in regime demonstrations found their boxes cut off. It was starvation as social control, a calculated strategy to break resistance through hunger. Meanwhile, Maduro and his inner circle grew obscenely wealthy. High-ranking military officers ran drug trafficking operations through what investigators call the Cartel of the Suns, moving tons of cocaine through Venezuela to markets in North America and Europe. The regime partnered with Colombian guerrilla groups, international organized crime, and even Hezbollah operatives, turning Venezuela into a narco-state whose corruption flowed from the presidential palace down through every level of government. By 2017, Maduro's crimes had become too brazen to ignore internationally. Reports documented extrajudicial killings carried out by specialized police units known as FAES, which conducted raids in poor neighborhoods and executed young men en masse, staging the scenes to look like armed confrontations. UN human rights experts would later estimate at least 2,000 such killings between 2018 and 2020 alone. Torture in detention facilities became routine, with prisoners subjected to extended isolation, beatings severe enough to cause permanent injury, and psychological torment, including threats against family members. Political persecution expanded to include not just opposition politicians but journalists, lawyers, doctors who spoke about hospital conditions, and even ordinary citizens who criticized the government on social media. Trials were held in military courts where due process was a fiction, and sentences of 20 to 30 years were handed down for social media posts. The 2018 presidential election was a farce. Major opposition leaders were banned from running, jailed, or in exile. The vote was held months ahead of schedule to prevent opposition organization, and international observers reported massive irregularities. Maduro claimed a landslide victory that virtually no independent analyst considered legitimate. It was at this point that much of the international community ceased to recognize Maduro as Venezuela's legitimate leader. In early 2019, National Assembly President Juan Guaido invoked constitutional provisions to declare himself interim president, arguing that Maduro's fraudulent election made the presidency vacant. Over 50 countries, including the United States and most of Latin America and Europe, recognized Guaidó, creating a bizarre situation where Venezuela had two competing claims to leadership. But Maduro held the guns, the gold, and the loyalty of enough military commanders through bribery and blackmail to maintain physical control of the country. The years from 2019 to 2024 became a grinding stalemate. Maduro's Venezuela faced crippling international sanctions, particularly from the United States, which targeted oil sales, froze foreign assets, and indicted Maduro and his top officials on narco-terrorism charges. The Justice Department offered $25 million for information leading to his capture, treating him like a fugitive drug lord rather than a head of state. Yet Russia, China, Cuba, Iran, and Turkey provided lifelines, financial support, weapons, military advisors, and diplomatic cover in international forums. China extended billions in loans secured against future oil production, while Russia sent Wagner Group mercenaries to train security forces in repression techniques. Iran helped Venezuela evade sanctions through illicit oil swaps and gold smuggling. Cuba sent intelligence operatives who helped Maduro build surveillance networks to monitor and crush dissent before it could organize. Despite this support, Venezuela continued to deteriorate. The COVID-19 pandemic hit the collapsed health system with devastating force. Gasoline shortages in what was once OPEC's largest producer forced Venezuelans to wait days in lines for fuel. Even regime loyalists began to grow restless as conditions worsened, though fear kept most silent. Maduro's answer was more oppression. Each wave of protest in 2019, 2020, and particularly after the July 2024 presidential election, brought fresh atrocities. The 2024 election was particularly egregious. The opposition, unified behind candidate Edmundo Gonzalez, presented detailed precinct-by-precinct evidence showing Gonzalez had won overwhelmingly. Maduro nonetheless declared himself the winner and refused to release verifiable tallies. When Venezuelans took to the streets to protest, security forces killed at least 25 people in a matter of days and arrested more than 2,000, including children as young as 14. Torture reports from those arrested described systematic brutality designed to terrorize an entire generation out of resistance. By late 2025, even some of Maduro's international supporters began to distance themselves as the evidence of crimes against humanity mounted. The United Nations Independent Fact-Finding Mission on Venezuela released report after report documenting systematic torture, extrajudicial execution, enforced disappearances, and persecution that met the legal definition of crimes against humanity under the Rome Statute. The International Criminal Court opened a formal investigation in 2022, though Maduro refused to cooperate. Regional organizations, like the Organization of American States, expelled Venezuela's representation and demanded free elections and accountability for abuses. Human rights groups documented names, dates, locations, and methods of abuse in excruciating detail, building what prosecutors hoped would eventually become a comprehensive legal case against Maduro and his top lieutenants. Meanwhile, the human toll continued to mount. By 2025, an estimated 300,000 people had passed through Venezuela's political prison system. Thousands remained in detention without trial. The UN estimated that over 25,000 people have been victims of extrajudicial killings or enforced disappearances since Maduro took power. The refugee crisis strained neighboring countries. Colombia alone hosted over 2 million Venezuelan refugees, while countries as distant as Chile and Argentina saw their social services stretched by the influx. Within Venezuela, those who remained faced grinding poverty, with over 90% of the population living below the poverty line and basic services like electricity, water, and internet intermittent at best. The humanitarian catastrophe was total. Throughout 2025, tensions between Maduro's Venezuela and the United States escalated as President Trump's administration took an increasingly aggressive stance toward what it termed criminal regimes in the hemisphere. Intelligence reports indicated that Venezuela had become a transit hub, not just for drugs, but potentially for international terrorist organizations seeking footholds in the Americas. There were also concerns that Russia and China were using Venezuela as a platform for military surveillance and potentially offensive capabilities aimed at the United States. Behind closed doors, military planners reportedly developed contingency plans for action against the Maduro regime should certain red lines be crossed. Then, in the early hours of January 3, 2026, those plans became reality. U.S. military forces, reportedly acting on intelligence about Maduro's location and in coordination with elements within the Venezuelan military opposed to the regime, conducted surgical strikes on key regime facilities in Caracas and other locations. Details remained murky in the immediate aftermath, but reports indicated that Maduro was captured during the operation and was in U.S. custody. President Trump announced the development in characteristically bold terms, declaring that a major narco-terrorist had been taken off the streets and that justice would finally come to Venezuela. The reaction was seismic. Celebrations erupted in Venezuelan exile communities worldwide, particularly in Miami, Colombia, and Spain, where hundreds of thousands of refugees had rebuilt their lives. In Venezuela itself, reports suggested confusion, with some regime elements attempting to maintain control while others defected or disappeared. The full details of what had transpired, how exactly the operation unfolded, what legal framework would govern Maduro's detention and potential trial, and what would come next for Venezuela, remained uncertain as the world processed the stunning development. For the millions of Venezuelans who had suffered under Maduro's 13-year reign of terror, who had watched their country destroyed, their families torn apart, their futures stolen, the news brought something between relief and disbelief. Could it really be over? Would those responsible for so much death and suffering finally face justice? Or would international politics and backroom deals find a way to let the guilty escape again? As Caracas tentatively stirred on that January morning, as word spread through communities of exiles across continents, and as human rights investigators and prosecutors began preparing their cases, one thing was certain: Nicolas Maduro's story had reached a turning point. Whether it would end in true accountability or become another chapter of impunity would define not just Venezuela's future, but the international community's willingness to enforce the promise that crimes against humanity cannot and will not be tolerated, no matter who commits them or where they hide. The bus driver who became a dictator was finally facing the justice he had denied to millions.